From beanies to carry bags and from shoes to caps, browse our shop now at tntradio.live. What a crazy time to be alive. Charlie Robinson on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
We are back with hour number 2 of the Charlie Robinson Show. If you want to connect with me, the email address is charlierobinson@tntradio.live. You can follow me on Twitter @macroaggressions. You can go to my website, theoctopusofglobalcontrol.com, find out everything about the books I've written and the podcasts that I do. And if you are interested in coming to Anarchapulco this year in February 2024, the largest anarchist conference in the world, well, guess what? I'm not just going to be there. I'm going to be the host and MC of the entire week-long event. So come down to Mexico in February in Acapulco and hang out with some like-minded people for an entire week. Have a great time. Well, let's bring in Cory Hughes. Cory is my co-host from Day Zero. He is the author of a new book on JFK called A Warning from History. And I think that it's been, I don't know, 6 decades, but this is still might be the most important event in American history. Cory, good to see you again, man. What's going on? How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Yeah, well, okay. We're gonna have to do more talking than that. For God's
a man of few words.
Really? You're a man of few words. I've heard some of the words. Listen, this we're coming up on the 60-year anniversary of this thing. Okay, and by all accounts, the assassination of John F. Kennedy, it most definitely put America on a different trajectory. And there's been a lot of movies, and there's been a lot of books, and there's been a lot of disinformation. And you have been working on this book for a while. I've had a kind of a front row seat where you've been able to send me chapters in advance, and I've read this, and holy moly, man. This is a book that I think everybody needs to read, because you come at this from an angle that a lot of people are maybe kind of scared to talk about, the relationship, about who is actually behind this. Let's just start from the beginning. Tell it, the official story of JFK, his assassination is nonsensical. We know this. You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to have questions about this. In fact, the term conspiracy theorist was, as we know, invented as a disinformation tactic to get people from talking, to steer them away from talking about these things. But it's an important topic, and there's real questions about this assassination. How'd you even wind up? How did this even get on your radar as a topic to cover? Because it's basically like become a huge part of your life. I mean, you and I have been talking about this for years now.
Years, yeah. This work has been all consuming. I hate to think that it has defined my life, but I kind of feel like it has, at least in the last couple of years. So the official story is that, Lee Harvey Oswald killed Kennedy because he was a communist, blah, blah, blah. However, there is what I call the official conspiracy theory. And this is the official conspiracy theory that's pushed by the government and all the shills who want you to believe the official conspiracy theory. And that is that Kennedy was killed by the CIA over a conspiracy in regards to his pulling out of Vietnam, which honestly is the most ridiculous, nonsensical explanation for the assassination ever. Kennedy and McNamara had just spent $6 billion with a B on helicopters and airplanes. Kennedy wasn't pulling out of anything, and the few scant documents that shows Kennedy was reallocating troops to different places, people use as for the reason for the assassination by the CIA and Army intelligence and all this stuff. It is ridiculous. From what I could tell, the bottom line is that nobody in American intelligence, nobody in the government, nobody in the military had the cojones to greenlight this thing. So they did what the CIA does best, and they offloaded it to a foreign entity, Israel, and allowed them to facilitate the large-scale planning through a Mossad front company called Permindex, which was actually founded by a guy named George Mandel, who was a Hungarian Jew who was praised as some sort of hero during the Holocaust. But when you look at how the money flowed through Permindex to a company in Montreal called Centre Mondial Commercial, run by a guy named Louis Bloomfield, this opens the door to the connections to Clay Shaw, and David Ferry and all the guys down in New Orleans, because Clay Shaw sat on the board of directors of Permindex and the board of directors of Centre Mondial Commercial. I have numerous documented trips of him flying with David Ferry to Montreal from New Orleans with other conspirators, primarily Kerry Thornley and a guy named Sergei Arkacha-Smith. So the connections between the Israeli Mossad to the CIA to the United States Mafia, those are all highlighted in the board of directors of Permindex, right? It was a who's who of intelligence, mafioso, including like the Corsican Mafia out of France. There was even some ex-Nazis like Halmar Schacht on the board of directors of Permindex, along with Gershon Perez, who was the brother of Shimon Peres, who was the prime minister of Israel, right? So it's a who's who of Nazis, Zionists, and intelligence and mafia people who really in 1963 were all on the same page politically, which is crazy.
Yeah.
When I first started to get into the assassination, I never understood the relationship, how some of these guys could be working for the FBI, CIA, and Mossad simultaneously. But the relationship there is, to me, makes perfect sense.
Well, especially now after you look at Jeffrey Epstein and you can see that a guy could have multiple allegiances and could be working with multiple intelligence agencies at the same time. But one of the things that surprised me so much about the Kennedy assassination and your work into it is how international in scope it is. Now, there's this assumption that this was it's an American president, it's an in-house cleansing operation that we talk about Dallas, we talk about Washington, D.C., and we understand these things. But then you start to expand out a little bit and you start to find out the role of Galveston, the role of Miami, Cuba, Montreal, Israel. We start to find that this was not just a Dallas, and by the way, also Dallas turned out to be the final option, but there were plots to take him out in Chicago and elsewhere, right? So this was Dallas their first choice, or was this just the best scenario they could put together?
So this is an odd one because you have clearly evidence of plots in Tampa and in Chicago that same month in the weeks leading up to this assassination. You have clearly evidence of plots in Tampa and in Chicago that same month in the weeks leading up to this assassination. You have obvious plans to assassinate him. However, the Secret Service thwarted the plot in Miami and Chicago, and Kennedy never ended up doing either of those. He never participated in the motorcade in either of those cities. The problem I have with these other plots is that in Dallas, the plot to establish Lee Harvey Oswald as the patsy goes back to March of 1963, so they were planning it long term. By my calculations, the actual decision to assassinate Kennedy happened sometime in February of 1963 at the spring meeting of Permindex, which is pretty well documented. The members who were there are pretty well documented. I'm pretty convinced the actual planning, the decision to kill Kennedy took place there. And then almost immediately you have the setup beginning because they ordered in March of 1963 the rifle and the handgun under the name Alec Heidel to a P.O. box in Dallas. And allegedly, these are the weapons that were used in the assassination of Kennedy and in the killing of Officer J.D. Tippit. However, when you dig into the logistics surrounding the rifle and the handgun, you'll find that the rifle, the money order that they present to us as having been the money order that Lee Harvey Oswald allegedly sent, it's clearly a forgery. It's a fake. When you look at it, you can see the stamps on the front of the money order bled through to the back. So you can clearly see the date stamp of March 12th on the back of the money order. The problem is in 1963, those money orders were made out of hard cardstock, not paper. And the original document doesn't exist. All we have are photocopies of this alleged money order. So the money order is out the window. It basically breaks the chain of connectivity between Oswald and the rifle. And then when you have the revolver, right? The revolver with the modified barrel that was used in the assassination of J.D. Tippit, what you have is that it ended up being shipped from a company called Seaport Traders. It was rejected by the post office because of the name. Alec Heidel was not the name listed to Lee Harvey Oswald, the name on the P.O. box. And then it ended up going to an offsite holding facility where a man picked it up by the name of Paxton. So there's no evidence tracing the rifle or the handgun back to Lee Harvey Oswald. And in fact, the rifle we know came from a group of 70 Carcanos that came in that was shipped to the country by a company called Adams Consolidated. It then went to Crescent Firearms, and then allegedly the Kleins. Well, I hate to break it to you, all of these are CIA weapons companies. And so we have a pretty clear line of documentation on where the rifles came from, how it got into the States, and who ended up with it. And it turns out there are actually 3 Carcanos. One of them was owned by David Ferry. Another one was owned by a guy named Emilio Santana. And the third one was used to set up Lee Harvey Oswald, all shipped in the same batch. Pretty fascinating.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. So the CIA's got their front companies all over the place here, bringing in weapons, flying people around, Permindex. What was Permindex's, what was the official narrative of what this company was used for?
Well, Permindex stands for the Permanent Industrial Exhibition. They were supposedly they were going to be putting on like World's Fair type exposés, at which case various companies could display their products and whatnot. However, they dabbled a little bit in the nuclear business, and there was some indication that they were heavy holders of stocks in the nuclear industry and facilitated some nuclear projects. The problem is the company known as Permindex, despite their assets and holdings, is not known to have ever conducted any known business. And by 1962, they were connected with the numerous attempts on the life of Charles de Gaulle because they were funding the OAS, the Organisation Armée Secrète in France, which is like a paramilitary wing of the Corsican Mafia. Weird kind of relationship there, but they were also connected to the assassination of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, and ultimately they were set up in Switzerland, and the Swiss government pulled their incorporation. And so in 1962 they moved from Switzerland because of their overt connections to the assassinations on de Gaulle. They're moved to South Africa, and they're based in South Africa at the time of the Kennedy assassination.
Interesting. Okay, so Permindex is a front company that actually specializes in assassinations. That's
basically, yeah. They're considered many consider them an assassination factory. That was like a quote from the Swiss when they kicked him out of the country.
Ooh. Okay, well, that's not good. And their role in Dallas was...
well, you have to think on the board of directors of Permindex was Alan Dulles, James Angleton, Joe Bonanno, the mobster, then Mo Dalitz, the guy who ran Las Vegas somewhat. And then you had guys like Gershon Perez, and you had like Roy Cohn, who was Trump's lawyer in the 80s. It was then Tibor Rosenbaum, who was the head of a bank called the Banque de Crédit International, which is the primary bank that all the money flowed through. And it's also the bank that was used by Israel when they first became a country back in 1948. BCI was the bank that they did all their international transactions with. Well, BCI turned out to be the bank that facilitated large-scale money laundering for Meyer Lansky and the United States Mafia in their drug trafficking, which they were partnered to the hilt with the Israelis. The Meyer Lansky and Menachem Begin directly created the drug trafficking routes between Venezuela and Saigon. And then that heroin from Saigon ended up back in France. And then you have the French connection when it was sent back to New York to Lansky's crew in New York, right? So you have the Israelis and Meyer Lansky, the head of the United States Mafia, like working together, right? And so Permindex and CMC were CIA and Mossad creations that facilitated the use of these mafia characters for large-scale drug trafficking, money laundering, and assassinations. That's kind of the role that Permindex played.
Yeah, there's a great part in I don't know if it's book 1 or book 2, Whitney Webb's One Nation Under Blackmail. She's talking about the relationship between all of these Roy Cohn and J. Edgar Hoover. And that there, Roy Cohn is this ambitious lawyer, and J. Edgar Hoover is this head of the FBI, and they have and they're sort of at odds with one another, and yet they have this mutual respect in mutually assured destruction, the blackmail on each other. So they got to a point where there's a scene in the book where she writes about how they've set up this party at the Plaza Hotel that Roy Cohn has set it up. It's like, one of these little like Boys Town type parties where all the young twinks show up and they get paraded out and pimped out to all these well-connected gentlemen that are there for services and whatnot. And J. Edgar Hoover shows up to the party dressed as a woman, right? Just walks right in, and everyone is like, what are we supposed to do with this information? That the head of the FBI has just walked in dressed completely in drag as a woman. And the point of it all was that Roy Cohn was like, this is essentially my enemy, but we have this deep respect for one another, and we have such dirt on each other that I could take you down, you could take me, you could take everybody in this entire room down. So why don't we do this? Why don't we just have a nice, good, long party, have a fun time? You dress like a woman. We won't say anything. We'll continue to run our mafia operations. You allow us to. And what we discover during, the watching this party unfold is that there really is almost no difference between the government and organized crime. And I don't think anywhere is that more on display than with the JFK assassination. We'll be back with Cory Hughes after this break. This is TNT Radio.
TNT Radio's Jesse Zerowell.
Hey T, much has been going on over the past few days. Much has been going on there for
decades,
over 100
honestly.
years. Yeah.
This latest effort, you could say, which isn't a full-on peacekeeping mission, but is that a multilateral security support mission. This is the latest effort to bring in more troops onto the island of Haiti to further occupy the island, because right now the main proxy occupation of the island happening is via the BNU office, which is, again, just an office in a sense, which works with various governmental sectors in Haiti to surveil the citizens, to keep them under the thumb of the US and the UN and the UK and France and Canada, etc. And also to now as well in the past couple decades especially to push that quote-unquote sustainable development agenda.
Jesse Zerowell on today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
The Light is Britain's far-right conspiracy theory paper spreading hate and vicious lies. No, that's just what the BBC say. The Light is the only national newspaper bringing you the real news and informed opinion on what's really going on today. You can subscribe, order copies, submit articles, and read back issues on our website, thelightpaper.co.uk, and see for yourself why the establishment are so worried about the uncensored truth getting out to people every month. The Light Paper. Not for right, just right so far. Thelightpaper.co.uk.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Today's News Talk,
News and information.
TNT Radio.
We are back with Cory Hughes, the author of A Warning from History. This book is fantastic about JFK. I'm not just saying that because I wrote the foreword to it, wink, wink, but also because it really comes at this from a totally different angle. Cory, what's the best place for people to find the book and support your work?
Well, the print books just hit Amazon, so you can go to Amazon.com and buy the print books there. And if you want the ebook, I'd go to buymeacoffee.com/JFK book, because if you go there, you have the ability to access my notes, my personal notes, 650 pages to accompany the book. You can buy those there. So that's the only place they're available is at buymeacoffee.com.
It's worth it. For those of you that think you know the JFK assassination and ins and outs of it, you're going to get information about things that you've never heard of before. Let's talk a little bit about the number of body doubles, because this was crazy to me. I had heard that there were people that sort of looked a little bit like Oswald, and I'd heard that there were, reports of this, but nobody ever really, I felt like nobody ever went into the details of all of this. And what you've discovered is that there were it wasn't just Oswald. There were body doubles of all kinds of people. It was like showing up to a twins convention or something, some sort of parallel universe where there's just a bunch of people that kind of all look the same, and they're doing things and they're making noise and they're acting unusual in public. And you hear these stories. You wrote about, I had read about this with 9/11 in the lead up to 9/11, where there are all the so-called Arab hijackers were out. getting into fights and bars and making a lot of noise in the days leading up to it, almost like very noticeable, like, hey, look at me here causing this problem. Look at me leaving my ID here with my name, Muhammad Atta. Look at me acting like a non-Muslim and at strip clubs and doing coke and all this stuff, and making themselves known to a point where it was obnoxious and obvious and almost as if you were creating the pretense for somebody to look back on that event and go, I did remember somebody that kind of looked a little suspicious or did match that description, acting like a jackass a couple of weeks ago now that you mention it. And then I'm reading your book and I'm coming across the same kind of behavior. So can we talk a little bit about the doubles and the people that were acting noticeably unusual in the days leading up to this event?
Sure. So the setup of Oswald is kind of wild because they screwed up big time in as far as when they began to impersonate Oswald. So the first known incident involving an Oswald lookalike occurred at the Bolton Ford dealership in New Orleans in January of 1961. Two men, one of them is described as Lee Harvey Oswald, looks like Lee Harvey Oswald gave the name Lee Oswald. The other man he's with is described as a large, husky Latino, dark complected with a pockmarked face. This Latin character you will see for the next 2.5 years leading up to the assassination. His name is Lawrence Howard. Lawrence Howard is an ex-Marine, and he is between 61 and 63 in the assassination. He is spending much of his time and traveling back and forth across the country with two men, William Seymour and Loren Hall. Now, William Seymour is one of two men who was impersonating Oswald for a period of at least 2 years leading up to the assassination, heavily in the months September, October, and November in Dallas in particular. So the reason that he was mistaken for Oswald so often is because he looked just like Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, when I say that these guys look like Oswald, because there was another Oswald impersonator named Kerry Thornley. When I say that these guys look like Oswald, I mean that they are the same general height, same general weight, build, same color hair, same skin tone, same receding hairline. And that if these people are not observed together and they're not individually scrutinized, months later, when Oswald pops up on television, you have people going, oh my God, I think I remember that guy. He was the guy talking about communism in my store. Right. And so they did this for a period of years leading up to the assassination. Like I said, the first one being Bolton Ford. The problem is, for at least a year and a half after the Bolton Ford incident, Oswald's still in the Soviet Union. So we have 100% proof that somebody was impersonating Oswald in January of 61, all the way up to the time that he gets back from the Soviet Union in June of 1962. Now, I want to pause really quickly and just to really quickly comment on Oswald and what he was doing in the Soviet Union. Up until June of 1962, there was a program going on called AE Balcony, which was designed to get a spy into the Soviet Union. It was designed using naturalized citizens who spoke fluent Russian to then have them go to the Soviet Union and recruit more spies or send back information or whatever. That program came to an end of June of 1962. Oswald returned to the United States in June of 1962. He was clearly a part of AE Balcony, which fell under the Redskin program, which was a larger scale program going back to 1955 to get spies into the Soviet Union, mostly using naturalized citizens, meaning not Americans who spoke fluent Russian who became naturalized citizens. And this brings us back to the earliest iteration of the duplicate Oswalds, because John Armstrong, who wrote the book Harvey and Lee, did an amazing job of going back through documents all the way back to 1947, basically proving that Lee Harvey Oswald, as he was growing up, had a duplicate who was also a child, who was raised by another mother with the same name of Marguerite Oswald. Now, most people hear this and they're like, this is crazy. I think it would be crazy to not have this happen, because if the intelligence agencies were not thinking about a plan like this to try to get into the spy in the Soviet Union back in 1947 and beyond, then what the hell are they doing? Really, they should have been doing, they should have crazier plans than raising a duplicate child to infiltrate them into the Soviet Union. Not crazy at all. In fact, it's pretty tame when you consider some of the stuff they have going on in the modern era, right? So John Armstrong did a great job of uncovering this duplicate Oswald in his childhood, but that fractures once Oswald goes to the Soviet Union, That initial duplicate Oswald, I have no idea what happens to him, who he really was, or if I believe he might have even been the real Lee Harvey Oswald, and the person who was arrested on November 22nd was the later recruited imposter, probably plucked from some concentration camp or an Eastern Bloc country post World War II, and then raised in America with a mother. An American mother, right? So that would explain why Oswald spoke fluent Russian when he had there was no evidence of him ever having studied Russian ever, right? All the things that people say of him studying Russian are nonsense. He automatically one day just started reading Russian newspapers and stuff. I mean, so I think it's pretty obvious that he spoke fluently as a child. But to get into that, you got to get into John Armstrong's book, and he got a lot wrong. So it's hard for me to recommend his work, even though his data is correct. His conclusions are garbage, and I think it's difficult for most people to kind of differentiate the two. I try to, in my book, to explain how Armstrong got it right and he got it wrong at the same time. But yeah, it's undoubtedly that in the months leading up to the assassination, you have two men who are impersonating Oswald, William Seymour and a guy named Cory Thornley. And based on my research, I have zero evidence that Lee Harvey Oswald was ever at the book depository on November 22nd, 1963. And all the evidence in the world points to the fact that he was actually being impersonated in the depository by a man named William Seymour. And then this opens the door to the book depository having been a CIA front, which it clearly was. The top guys in the company, O.V. Campbell, Roy Truly, and William Shelley, all three of those guys were OSS during World War II. All of them worked in CIA publishing after the war. And after William Shelley, who was Oswald's alleged immediate boss, after he leaves the book depository, he goes and works for the Scott Forsman Company, which is a CIA publishing company, right? So these guys were lifelong intelligence operatives. And when you get into the mechanics of what happened inside the book depository, it becomes clear William Shelley was a willing conspirator. He killed the power to the building, which froze the elevators on the 6th floor, allowing the assassins to escape. And then the other two guys, Roy Truly, he was clearly in on the setup of Oswald because he provided an address to Lee Harvey Oswald, for Lee Harvey Oswald, to the Dallas police that Oswald never gave the book depository, right? He gave him an address in Fort Worth where the Paynes were living as his home address. But when they went to bust him, Roy Truly mysteriously had an address that Oswald was allegedly living at that, I'll give you a hint, Oswald never actually lived at. So the entire staff, the hierarchy of the book depository, with the exception of O.V. Campbell, were all in on the Roy Truly and William Shelley at the book depository were completely in on the assassination, helped set up Oswald, helped the assassins get out of the building. It's very clear when you look at the chronology of what happened at the book depository that they were all in on it.
Well, we've got another double, too. We've got Officer J.D. Tippit. Who's he look like?
So here's the thing. I'm glad you commented on that because J.D. Tippit, they say, looks like Kennedy, and that's why he was killed. I think it's purely nonsensical. Okay. So J.D. Tippit allegedly looked like Kennedy, and they allegedly the police made fun of him and stuff because he looked like Kennedy. I think that's 100% fabrication. I don't think any of that's true. When you get into the story of J.D. Tippit was obviously part of the conspiracy to kill Kennedy because he's standing in Dealey Plaza on Houston Street as captured in the Robert Hughes film. But the official story, no one ever says that he's there. And so why would they cover for him the entire time? Right. So ultimately, J.D. Tippit is he's supposed to pick somebody up at the bus stop near the Gloco station in North Oak Cliff. So after he leaves Dealey Plaza, he goes to meet this person at the bus stop at the Gloco station. And it just turns out that bus that he was allegedly supposed to meet was allegedly the bus that Oswald gets on to flee. But nobody ever got on that bus. Oswald never got on a bus to flee from Dealey Plaza. That's a whole long story in and of itself. But yeah. J.D. Tippit is supposed to meet somebody as they get off the bus. That person doesn't get off the bus. He then flees to the Top 10 record store, makes a panicked phone call. Nobody answers. He's probably calling Captain Westbrook at the Dallas Police Department, who was ultimately involved in Tippit's assassination. So after Tippit is unable to reach his contact because he's not able to pick somebody up at the bus stop that he's supposed to, he heads to the area of 10th and Patton, which is a prearranged meeting spot. It wasn't chance that he ended up there. He meets with Westbrook and Croy, who drove Cory Thornley there, and Cory Thornley is the Oswald lookalike who murders J.D. Tippit. David Ferry is also on scene, and they end up fleeing after they murder him. And Cory Thornley ends up at the Texas Theater, where there's a whole lot of shenanigans go on in the Texas Theater. Oswald ends up there between 1 o'clock and 1:07, which precludes him from having assassinated J.D. Tippit because J.D. Tippit was killed at 1:06 p.m., right? So Oswald's already in the theater by the time that Cory Thornley assassinates J.D. Tippit. He then flees to the Texas Theater. The cops are hot on his trail, He stops in front of Hardy's shoe store where a guy named Johnny Brewer, who's also in on this, is in the store with two other men, a guy named Tommy Rowe, who's a friend of Jack Ruby, and a CIA/mafioso spook named Igor Vaganov. So they're inside the Hardy shoe store at the time that Oswald allegedly goes by at 1:36 p.m., but it's not Oswald. Oswald's been in the theater for a half an hour. So Oswald gets in the theater between 1 o'clock and 1:07, and he sits in front of a guy named Jack Davis. Now, there's 900 seats in this theater. There's only 22 people in the theater, and he sits down directly in front of Jack Davis, and he then gets up and sits right next to Jack Davis. And Jack Davis is like, what is wrong with this guy? There's 900 seats in this theater, and he's sitting directly next to me. After a couple of minutes, Oswald gets up, and he does it again. He sits next to somebody directly, and then he does it 2 or 3 more times. Eventually, he sits down next to a pregnant woman, and he and the pregnant woman speak for a minute, and then he and the pregnant woman get up and go to the lobby. The pregnant woman leaves. Oswald buys popcorn at 1:15 p.m. He then goes back to his seat in the theater and continues to eat his popcorn for 30 minutes until the cops arrive there and arrest him. Now, if Oswald had been involved with the assassination, if he even knew that the assassination had occurred, if he had anything to do with the assassination whatsoever, would he have just sat in a theater eating popcorn, watching War is Hell for 30 minutes after he met with his handler? I don't think so. Oswald didn't have a clue anything was going on because Oswald is a patsy, just like he said. Oswald was being kept away from Dallas. He was being kept out of town so that they could set him up. All of the incidents that we attribute to Lee Harvey Oswald, like at the gun range, these are fabricated incidents involving impersonators, one of two, William Seymour and Kerry Thornley, in order to present this image of him as a dissident communist that talked about communism everywhere he went. And literally the list of people who remembered talking to Oswald after the assassination is over 100. And it's crazy.
Wow.
Yeah, all of these incidents, and you can find all these if you look into Harold Weisberg and his false Oswald file. You'll find at least 100 PDFs of various incidents of people who met with a person they believed to be Lee Harvey Oswald, who clearly was not Oswald. So they went into overtime, putting in, having people impersonate Oswald all over the place, setting up this persona. Now, I'll be honest, initially, that setup was probably to get him into Cuba as a spy. It probably had nothing to do with the assassination because the assassination planning didn't go down until 1963, but they were setting him up provably 2 years before that in 1961. They were setting him up as a communist. So why would they do that? There's no other explanation other than to try to repurpose him to get into Cuba, right? So we have a guy who defects to the Soviet Union, comes back to the States, and then tries to continue that that spycraft of getting into Cuba. I think that's what was going on. Then they repurposed him. And I think part of the reason that he felt he got sucked into this was because he brought back a Russian spy, right? Marina was a Russian spy. She was in on the setup of Oswald from day one. She was actively setting him up while he was out working. Right. So a lot of the incidents of the duplicate Oswald involving Kerry Thornley were times at which he was seen with a pregnant woman with a child. And the only pregnant woman with a child in the story is Marina Oswald. And I was able to prove the relationship between Kerry Thornley and Marina in New Orleans. So therefore, I've got a dozen sightings or more of Oswald where he's talking about communism, talking about rifles and stuff, but he's seen with Marina Oswald and her child. So, yeah, she mailed the whole time like, hey, you're going to help us or you're going to go back to the Soviet Union, right? And we're going to tell them all kinds of stuff, right? So she didn't want to go back to the Soviet Union under any circumstances, and so she went along with it. And then she even tried after the assassination in like the 80s and the 90s to try to drop hints that Oswald was innocent and that she was involved, but she never outright said it. So it's a shame. She died, but the amount of secrets that woman died with is unreal.
Well, somebody else died in this scenario too, right? And it was Oswald, right? And he was killed by a gentleman named Jack Rubenstein, but we know him as Jack Ruby. Can we talk about what his background is?
Yeah, so Jack Ruby's lifelong mobster. Okay, and people are like, well, he was Jewish. He couldn't have been a made guy. I don't understand. Well, yeah, it's because Jews ran the mob post 1931 when Meyer Lansky took out Salvatore Maranzano and Joe Masseria, right? So the mob was run by Jews. And so you have this entire network of Jewish mobsters who are not made guys, who are presented to the world as like low-level associates of the Italians. So it's ridiculous because the Jews controlled the mob. When you come to understand who the big shots in the mob were, you got to think Meyer Lansky, and then you have Bugsy Siegel back in the day, and you have Albert Anastasia, Lepke Buchalter, all these guys, Mickey Cohen, all of Cohen's associates. These are all Jews who ran the biggest names in U.S. history in the mafia, right? So, yeah, that's the relationship there. The Italians never ran anything the Sicilians. When people think of the mob and they think Italians, they're really thinking Sicilians. That's what they're thinking. But no, the Sicilians only ran the mob from 1921 to 1931. After that, Meyer Lansky ran the show.
Yeah. And Jack Ruby was one of his guys.
Yeah. So Jack Ruby started out working for Al Capone. After the fall of Capone, Jack Ruby ends up, there's some scuttlebutt over why Jack Ruby ended up going to Dallas. Some people think that he had a falling out with the Chicago mob, and so they expelled him, but I don't think that's not true whatsoever, because he maintained all of his connections. I mean, the number of Chicago outfit guys who would come down to meet with Jack Ruby was unbelievable. He seemed to know everybody. He was personally connected to Sam Giancana. It was funny because I just watched a movie called Momo, the Sam Giancana story, and there's a scene in it where they're talking to Giancana's daughter, and they're watching the television on the 24th, and they see Oswald get shot by Ruby, and Giancana's like, "Oh my God, that's Jacob!" Like, so her when she said that, number one, it proved the relationship between him and Giancana, but also it showed that Giancana didn't have anything to do with the assassination of Oswald. And he was shocked when he saw it on television, which is 100% correct, because the decision to come down that came down to take out Oswald was handed off to Jack Ruby by a guy named Al Gruber. Al Gruber was the right-hand man of Mickey Cohen in Los Angeles. And Mickey Cohen, who's a Jew, was so involved in the Israeli cause that the United States mafiosos were pissed at him because he was shirking his duties here in America to do things for the Israelis. Menachem Begin was his personal rabbi in 1949. Mickey Cohen single-handedly raised millions of dollars for the Israelis pre-1948. If it wasn't for the U.S. Mafia and guys like Mickey Cohen, Bugsy Siegel, and Meyer Lansky, there would not be a state of Israel today. It was the money laundering of the drugs from Venezuela that funded the state of Israel. Period. Like, that's they're an illegal criminal state funded by fucking drug money. Oh, excuse me, I didn't mean to curse.
But let's stay with this too, because the official story for why JFK was shot was because he didn't want to expand the Vietnam War, right? So, and you say that that's not the case. Is the real reason that JFK was shot was because of the Dimona nuclear power plant?
That was the straw that broke the camel's back. Ultimately, he was going to end all aid to Israel. He was going to have them completely cut off. He knew about numerous things. He knew that starting in 1945, Ben Gurion and Rudolf Sonborn had been basically pilfering our surplus World War II weapons through various armories, particularly like the Oxnard Armory in California was a big one that got broken into. The Homa bunker owned by the Schlumberger Corporation, which was robbed by David Ferry and his guys. That was all a really big deal, because all that weapons and all those arms were going, instead of going to the anti-Castro Cubans like everyone believes, all that weapons and arms and money that was being raised for the anti-Castro Cubans was getting funneled to Israel to fight the Palestinians. And so he knew about that, and he knew about NUMEC. He knew about Zalman Shapiro, a Jew from Philadelphia, who was basically opened the Nuclear Materials and Equipment Corporation in Apollo, Pennsylvania, to make refined fuels for the nuclear submarines. Well, he did that, but he also smuggled 600 pounds of uranium and shipped it to Israel, completely illegally, completely with the aid of the CIA, and Kennedy knew this as well. And so these factors, combined with the fact that they were building a nuclear reactor in Dimona, Kennedy was done. He was fed up, and he was going to cut all aid to Israel. He was going to end the nuclear program, and he was going to end Israel as a country. That's basically the bottom line. It was a war of wills between Kennedy and the Israelis. And since the Israelis don't seem to abide by international law, they'd rather shoot you than negotiate with you. That's exactly what they did. They knew that there was no negotiating with Kennedy, because Kennedy understood exactly who the Israelis were and exactly what they were doing. And he was not going to allow that to happen, because the creation of the state of Israel has been the worst thing to happen to planet Earth in the 20th century. It is the cause of all unrest in the world post 1948. And Kennedy wasn't having it anymore, and they took him out. And they did it through their relationships with the U.S. Mafia, particularly the L.A. mob, and then the relationships between Ben Gurion and Meyer Lansky directly, and his close associations with Giancana and Trafficante. You're one person removed from the top three mob bosses to David Ben Gurion of Israel. So,
yeah. Yeah,
And they
it's
were
a
all present.
real
Menachem Begin and Shamir and Rabin were all in Dallas.
really
So, yep, they were all in Dallas.
for what?
Rabin flew in the night before. He flew into the Air Force Base. We have the records of him flying into the Air Force Base the night before. And then in his wife's memoir that she published after he died, she wrote that they were both in Dallas that day, and they were shocked to find out Kennedy was killed when they got back to Israel later that night. Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir, I'm pretty convinced I have photographs of them in Dealey Plaza.
So there goes that story of them not knowing what was happening. Yeah, this is
Right.
this is a real dangerous situation. This is a group of people that there is no line that they will not cross. And I would suggest that if they in fact were the ones behind the assassination of JFK, and I'll tell you, your book lays it out pretty. I mean, it's pretty convincing. But if the Israelis were the ones behind JFK getting whacked, then if you kill our president, don't you sort of become the president in a weird sense?
Well, you have to think Johnson became president, right? And Johnson was a Jew. He's the third Jewish president after Hamilton and Lincoln. And so, of course, we've allegedly never had a Jewish president because he's a crypto Jew, right? So basically, he was their puppet from day one. He was funded and groomed and basically politically raised by the Israelis. He never won an election. He stole every election he was ever in. And once he became president on November 22nd, he handed them the keys to the kingdom, and they got everything they wanted. And if you need any proof of that, just look at things like the USS Liberty. And then you can go through like Iran-Contra, and then you can go through all the way through 9/11 and COVID-19. And then, the rest is history. America basically came to an end on November 22nd, 1963. We became an Israeli colony on that day. So
ooh, I'll tell you, if you want to know more about it, you're going to have to read the book. We'll be back with a final segment with Cory Hughes after this. This is TNT Radio.
De-weaponizing weather with reality and perspective.
You can see what years and years of propaganda is doing to the world. The fact is that our universities in the United States have become indoctrination centers. Now, I'm well aware of what they've done with the climate, but you can see other situations going on. And it all stems from the same root of evil. And that root of evil is hiding the truth, distorting the truth, or not telling the truth. And the problem you have, too, is that there's a complacency and a comfort that accepts such things, that doesn't go and research what's going on. Now, the situation in Israel, for instance, how is that linked to climate? Well, first of all, I'm surprised someone has not blamed climate change for that, but I'm being a bit sarcastic here. But it's the same root cause. The distortion of the real facts and using what are false ideas to try to push a point. And I'll tell you what, I don't know how much you can keep taking this stuff, be it geopolitically there or what they're trying to do with climate, and trying to convince you that the climate is causing you problems when in reality life has never been better on planet Earth. This is TNT climate and weather watchdog meteorologist Joe Bastardi asking you to enjoy the weather. It's the only weather you've
Challenging the consensus and debunking the narrative. This is Viewpoint.
Don't be fooled by so-called green steel made by using hydrogen rather than coal. This fraud will force up the price of steel for no environmental gain. Moving to unproven hydrogen technology will require expensive refits or replacement of steel manufacturing infrastructure. Since steel is used widely in construction and manufacturing, the costs will be enormous, just to satisfy nonsense net zero carbon goals, which denies nature-enhanced photosynthesis from the gas of life. The critics are not just conservatives. Jenny George, former Labour MP and president of the Australian Council of Trade Unions, has described the net zero emissions approach as a region's job killer, has scorned the false promises of green tech energy, and ridiculed, quote, the mantra of green steel, unquote. The World Economic Forum backs the Net Zero Steel initiative through its Mission Possible partnership. This threatens steel producers who don't swallow the net carbon zero swindle.
You have the power of information. Charlie Robinson on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
We are back with a final segment of the Charlie Robinson Show. We've got Cory Hughes here, the author of A Warning from History. I'm curious about this, Cory. So we have the assassination of Kennedy in 1963. And from that point, it's a branching off of the into a parallel reality. I'm curious. It's maybe a two-part question. What stopped on that day in 1963, and what went full speed ahead as a result of Kennedy being out of the way?
Well, I can tell you exactly what stopped, and that is 100% of all scrutiny on a federal level of Israel. That came to an end. All investigations of their past behavior into things like Newmark and the Sonborn Institute suddenly vanished, suddenly disappeared, and it paved the way for them to engage in the most egregious criminal conduct politically we've ever seen in the world. After the assassination of Kennedy, they felt emboldened. Hence, we have the assassinations of Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Fred Hampton, all these guys, all ultimately at the behest of the same people. So that has never ended. That has been unabated ever since. So we're talking about 60 plus years, coming up on 60 years of international Zionism feeling it can run away with whatever it wants to, do whatever it wants to do. And obviously, look what it's doing in Palestine today. They're about to murder 1.1 million people in Gaza, and the world is cheering it on. This is what 60 years of Zionist brainwashing has done. And not only brainwashing, but blackmail. Because if you disagree with the Zionist agenda, you get Jeffrey Epstein. That was the purpose of Jeffrey Epstein, you know?
Yeah, we've seen a lot of this. We've seen the media run cover for for a lot of Israel's crimes. And in the United States, that there's an imaginary line that if it's the third rail, right? You can't talk about some of these things without getting censored or canceled. I love TNT Radio because they give us an opportunity to have the difficult conversations, to talk about the people that you're maybe not allowed to talk about. And I think it was perfectly encapsulated when Benjamin Netanyahu stood up in front of Congress and gave a big presentation and spoke to the Congress like he was the president of the United States, made Obama look like a schmuck in comparison to, just sort of standing around like waiting, like who really runs the show here? And I think we got, I think for those of us that understand 9/11, that really know 9, and not like 19 Arab hijackers with box cutters that did this stuff. When you start to dig into who was behind the operation and you start to find the Project for a New American Century American Zionists, you start to find the Israeli Zionists involved in this, and you start to go, hang on a second, this aren't a bunch of Arabs that don't know how to fly planes. This is us and our so-called strongest ally in the Middle East that are doing this as a pretext to kickstart the war on terror, which would remake the Middle East into their image. It's pretty obvious to people that understand how this can go. They just take a look at and get truthful about 9/11 and they can see this. But you're not allowed to talk about this in the media in the United States. Why is that, Cory?
Well, you're never allowed to criticize your captors. I mean, that's ultimately what it comes down to, right? And so us being an Israeli colony, not having any sovereignty anymore, I think it pretty much explains everything that's gone on in this country since November 22nd, 63.
Yeah, it's thrown a monkey wrench into a lot of stuff. Lyndon Johnson, we were sort of talking about this guy. This is a gentleman that doesn't get a whole lot of press, but he was, by all accounts, out of his mind. A an unhinged psychopath. I have heard stories of what he's done to reporters, driving them out into the middle of nowhere, taking the newspaper, of which the reporter wrote a derogatory article of him, putting the reporter in his Cadillac, driving him out miles away into a Texas desert, stopping the car, unfolding the guy's newspaper, the guy that he wrote the story of, laying it out in the street in front, on this dirt road in front of the Cadillac, pulling his pants down, going to the bathroom on the newspaper, making the reporter sit there and watch this entire thing, getting back in the car, not saying anything, driving the reporter back to the pool of reporters, letting him out of the car and saying, keep that in mind the next time you write about me. This is an unhinged psychopathic maniac who was installed as the president of the United States, right? I mean,
yep.
The role of Lyndon Johnson in destroying this country doesn't get enough press, in my opinion. What's your take on this guy?
Yeah, he just did what he was told. I mean, the guy didn't do anything for America. Everything he did was meant to disrupt America. Remember, we've been on this pathway ever since Kennedy of social disruption, of overturning our norms, which has accelerated in recent years since COVID was a failure. But all this started under Johnson with the civil rights movement, which was never a movement about civil rights. It was a movement about upending American culture. That's what it was. It was about kicking off a starting point for us to bicker with each other, right? Because all the things that he did in the civil rights movement were all coming about naturally anyway. It didn't need to be enforced through a law. And therefore, I hold him directly responsible for the initial decline of this country, completely and totally.
Yeah, if you look back at Yuri Bezmenov's 4 steps for ideological subversion, the first 15 to 20 year process is the demoralization. And a lot of what they talk about was civil rights, installing a concept into Americans of equality, which is an unattainable goal, right? That the subverters know this is an unattainable goal. But if you can get everybody thinking that they're all equal and that they demand equal outcomes, even though they don't produce equal, they're not participating in equal effort or results of any kind, but they want equality. What Yuri was talking about was you'll get to a point where it will become quite obvious that this is unattainable. You'll never get there. And it has a feeling of basically taking the wind out of your sails and demoralizing you and having you think like, oh, there's no point in this. Is that part of what Lyndon Johnson was doing, taking people, building them up and saying, we're going to make you guys all equal, and then pulling the rug out from underneath them and showing them, well, in actuality, this equality concept is never going to work. We're going to have a Martin Luther King, we're going to have a Malcolm X, and then we're going to have a Fred Hampton, and then we're going to murder them all, right?
Yeah. So, and as far as Johnson and any president's awareness of what they're doing, I don't think so. Their handlers who push the agendas know what time it is, but I don't believe the presidents or the politicians who push this agenda understand the real root of it, right? Like COVID-19 was ultimately meant to discredit medical agencies, right? Like nobody has any confidence in the medical system in the country anymore. And that was 100% part of the plan when the COVID-19 came around, right? So, but the people who are the doctors and this and that who are pushing that don't know that, right? It's the larger scale thinkers who know what policies to implement that'll have an effect 10 years from now who push this stuff, whereas the individual politician is just a puppet, perhaps doesn't understand the larger implications of what they're doing with things like the civil rights movement, right? So how much division
that was evident
did that cost?
With COVID, since you mentioned that, it was evidenced by the SPARS pandemic document that was written in 2017. And in that document, this fictional document that talks about this outbreak of a coronavirus type event, it ends with the total distrust in the CDC and the American Medical Institute, and that they're calling for the heads of these people to be, put in, calling for them to off with their heads, I guess maybe proverbially, but literally being caged and run out of time. And that's how the simulation ends, with a total lack of trust in any sort of medical authority. I mean, it's almost, Cory, like they scripted it, right?
It's an intentional destruction, right? So it's about, you can't implement cultural Marxism and large scale communism unless you disrupt the current systems. And that's what they did. Look at our school systems. They're trash.
Ugh.
Okay. I'd never have a kid in these days because the future for them is bleak. So schools, hospitals, any kind of medical professionals. And now we have like corporations getting in on this woke game, pushing transgender nonsense, right? Yeah. Telling people that boys can be girls. It's ultimately ridiculous, and all of these people are they're useful idiots, right? They're pushing an agenda they don't understand by people who need to be executed as traitors.
Yeah,
that's what's going on.
It's been quite obvious that there's a destabilization, and boy, what a shame too, because if you think about what this country could have been if it wasn't constantly fighting these internal skirmishes against people that are trying to subvert it from the inside. We maybe could have been a shining beacon on the hill. Maybe we could have been aspirational for a lot of countries. I think a lot of countries look at America now and they just go, what happened to you guys, man? You used to be so cool, and now you're just like an embarrassing joke. It's been frustrating. Let's wrap up with this. Let's just make sure that everybody knows what's the best place for people to find the book, to connect with you, to support your work, because you're doing stuff that nobody else is doing, and I want people to know that it's out there and it's available, and if they're interested, they know where to find it.
Yeah, so the best place really right now to get the book is at Amazon. You can get the paperback at Amazon.com. So I highly recommend getting it there. If you want the ebook or my notes or any personal contact with me to join my private Telegram group, go to buymeacoffee.com/JFKbook and you can access all that stuff there.
Yeah, I think it's worth getting. Get it for your dad who wants to argue with you about JFK. Buy him this. Here's the perfect book for holiday season. Here's some light reading. You can learn about Permindex. You can learn about J.D. Tippett. You can learn about Jack Rubenstein. You can learn about the actual mafia, the Jewish mafia that is disguised by the Italian mafia. They deflect a lot of criticism away from it. Oh, I'm sure that's accidental, right? Wasn't by design at all. That's Cory Hughes, everybody. You can check out his outstanding work. I want to say big thanks to V. Lynn from Patriot Party Podcast and Freedom Gardens Electroculture, who was with me hour number 1, where we got into growing food. So for everybody out there, hopefully I'll see you in Mexico at Anarchapulco this year. That would be fantastic. But otherwise, we'll catch you next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. Thanks, everybody. Take care.